It's a reporting cliche to describe a breaking story as a bombshell, but where the news on Monday the 20th of May was concerned, no other word fit. That was the day that the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Karim Khan, made an announcement that landed with all the explosive power of a bunker buster. At a press conference beamed around the world, Khan explained that he would be seeking arrest warrants for those connected to events in Gaza and Israel since October the 7th. To no one's surprise, that included senior Hamas figures such as the group's political leader Ismail Haniyeh, military chief Mohammed Deif, and most senior figure in Gaza, Yahya Sinwar. Far more surprising was news that Khan would also be seeking warrants for two senior Israeli figures. One is Yoav Gallant, current defense minister. The other is even more controversial, and that's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Now, before we go any further, it's important to note that Khan himself does not have the power to issue arrest warrants. Instead, as the BBC reports, ICC judges will now decide whether they believe the evidence is sufficient to issue arrest warrants, something which could take weeks or months. Still, even though the process is far from complete, that didn't stop the announcement from causing an absolute storm. In Israel, Netanyahu made a speech detailing some of the horrific sexual crimes Hamas perpetrated on October the 7th and declared that Khan was creating a false equivalence akin to equating FDR with Hitler. In Gaza, Hamas likewise rejected the report, claiming the ICC should have gone after Israeli officials long ago and that Khan was equating the victim with the executioner. On the broader world stage, the report was one of the week's biggest stories. In the US, the Biden administration lashed out at the decision while the Republican Party mulled sanctions on the ICC's judges. Meanwhile, in Europe, cracks immediately began to emerge between the countries that generally support Israel, like Germany, and those, like Ireland, that are more sympathetic to the Palestinians. It was, in short, a momentous announcement, not just because of the ripples that it caused across the planet, but also for the number of taboos that it shattered. As The Economist's intelligence podcast pointed out, that's the first time the court's prosecutor has sought arrest warrants in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It also marked the first time the leader of a Western-style democracy has found himself in the sights of the ICC. Should the court's panel of judges approve the warrant, then Netanyahu will find himself keeping company with men like Omar al-Bashir of Sudan and Vladimir Putin. So yeah, it wouldn't be stretching things to say that Khan's press conference kind of a big deal. Yet all the noise around the announcement obscured what are perhaps the more interesting aspects of the story. A major one being whether there's any realistic chance of the court ever seeing any of the men in the dock. That this is a question is due to the way that the ICC works. Rather than function like a state court with its own police to back it up, the ICC instead requires countries that have ratified the Rome Statute to do the arresting on its behalf. Now, that's important because while the Rome Statute has a huge number of signatories, including the whole of the EU and the UK, it also has a lot of heavy hitters outside its framework. Russia, China, the USA, none of these nations ever ratified the statute. As a result, there are plenty of times when war crimes fall outside of the ICC's jurisdiction. To give one recent example, the Tigray War of 2020 to 2022 saw hundreds of thousands die of starvation after Ethiopia's government blockaded the region. Yet, because neither Ethiopia nor its ally Eritrea ever ratified the Rome Statute, the ICC has not sought arrest warrants for those responsible. We use Tigray as an example for two reasons. One, because the main charge leveled against Netanyahu and Gallant is eerily similar to what the Ethiopian government was accused of doing, starvation of civilians as a method of warfare. And two, because just like Ethiopia, Israel has never ratified the Rome Statute. Israeli officials are therefore now arguing that the court is overstepping its bounds, and not just regarding Netanyahu and Gallant. Another of Khan's targets, Hamas's overall leader, Ismail Haniyeh, is a resident of Qatar, which has not ratified the statute. The ICC's argument is that the Palestinian territories did ratify the statute in 2015. Since they include Gaza, the court is able to exercise jurisdiction where the Gaza war is concerned. However, that doesn't change the fact that someone would still have to execute the warrant, and it's here that things begin to get murky. Because despite the Rome Statute legally obliging its members to arrest those with outstanding warrants, in practice, countries don't always comply. Back in 2015, for example, Omar al-Bashir left Sudan to visit South Africa, one of the 124 countries to have signed the statute. Under an outstanding warrant for the genocide in Darfur, al-Bashir should have been arrested the moment he set foot in Pretoria. Instead, the South African government controversially promised him immunity to attend an African Union meeting. Although unusual, this case highlights a real limit on the court's power. Not only is it unable to arrest people in countries that haven't ratified the statute, but it also can't guarantee that signatory countries will carry out its will. The New Statesman conjured up an interesting hypothetical involving a trip by Netanyahu to Germany to visit a Holocaust site. While Germany has said that it would abide by any ICC warrants, the optics of arresting the leader of the world's only Jewish state at a Holocaust memorial might be a bit too much for Berlin to stomach. As the periodical wrote, of all imaginable diplomatic nightmares for Germany, it's hard to think of one that's worse. Yet even if every ally of Israel that ratified the Rome Statute could be guaranteed to execute the warrant, it's still unlikely to end with either Israeli or Hamas leadership before the court. The simple reason? There are just too many places where the court's reach is unrecognized. Israel will not hand over its own prime minister, nor will America if Netanyahu chooses to visit. Ismail Haniyeh, for his part, mostly spends his time in Qatar and Turkey, both non-signatories. That just leaves Hamas's military chief Mohammed Deif and its Gaza leader Yahya Sinwar. Both are now thought to be in Gaza, which technically puts them under the court's jurisdiction. But both will almost certainly be killed by Israel if they ever surface, which means chances of a trial are slim to non-existent. Even if they did make it to The Hague, a conviction might be unlikely. Since it began operation in 2002, the ICC has convicted a mere 10 people, only 3 of whom were handed sentences of over 7 years. It's not for nothing that the court is often derided as toothless. Given all that, you might find yourself wondering what this is all for. If Khan's announcement and the subsequent press coverage isn't nothing more than a lot of sound and fury, but really signifies nothing. That's certainly one way of looking at it. But there's another, more sympathetic take. One that says this latest announcement is an attempt to uphold international law, even as the rules-based system seems to be crumbling all around us. This is the angle the court itself is keen to emphasize. In Khan's statement, he declared that no foot soldier, no commander, no civilian leader, no one can act with impunity. If we ignore that and apply the law selectively, he went on to say, we will be creating conditions for its collapse. Indeed, the chief prosecutor seemed to go out of his way to be even-handed. While the potential arrest warrant against Israel's leader got all of the media coverage, Khan also called for Hamas to immediately release all hostages and accused the group of, quote, some of the most serious international crimes that shock the conscience of humanity, crimes which the ICC was established to address. Meanwhile, where Khan did go after Israel, he tried to back it up with statements by the government's own ministers. As The Economist explains, quoting, the indictment goes back to the early hours of the war when Yoav Gallant said that Gaza would be placed under a total siege for 2 weeks. In Gallant's own words, that meant, quote, I have ordered a complete siege on the Gaza Strip. There will be no electricity, no food, no fuel. Everything is closed. We are fighting human animals, and we are acting accordingly. On The Economist podcast, interviewee Greg Karlstrom was blunt in putting forward the case for supporting Khan's actions, quoting him, they, Israel and Hamas, are being held to the same standard here. And if there is such a thing as international law and rules-based order, then that is how international law is supposed to work. Now, of course, we can't pretend that everyone agrees with this take. In the US, former National Security Advisor to Donald Trump, Robert O'Brien, told Reuters that the Republican candidate should consider slapping sanctions on the ICC if he wins in November. Not a big leap, considering that Trump already placed travel restrictions on certain court members in 2020 following threats to investigate American soldiers for war crimes in Afghanistan. And in Israel, even many who normally oppose Netanyahu rallied around the prime minister. Leader of the opposition, Yair Lapid, for example, accused the ICC of drawing comparisons between the IDF and Hamas before insisting, there is no such comparison. We cannot accept it, and it is unforgivable. Still, it's clear that Karim Khan and the ICC are at least attempting to be fair in their investigations, to make it clear that even democracies and staunch allies of Washington aren't above international law. Unfortunately, it's not at all certain that Washington itself agrees. After supporting the ICC issuing an arrest warrant against Vladimir Putin in March of 2023, the Biden White House reacted furiously to the news that Netanyahu and Gallant could be indicted. The president himself called the charge outrageous. As law professor at Trinity College Dublin, Michael Becker told Vox, this could unintentionally help undermine global support for international laws and norms. In his words, US statements in support of human rights, anti-impunity, and the rule of law are undermined, if not eviscerated, when the US attacks an independent and impartial judicial process simply because it disagrees with the prosecutor's decisions or because individuals who are the leaders of a US ally may face charges. It could therefore be that the biggest impact of these indictments is not to bring Hamas or Israeli leaders to trial, but to convince other countries that such international norms can't be ignored when convenient. Another potential impact to watch is what happens in Europe. In America, the centers of both major parties are united in their support for Israel, with pro-Palestinian sentiments relegated to the left of the Democratic Party. It's not the case in Europe, though, where countries are both divided internally and also divided within the EU. Ireland, Spain, and non-EU Norway all recognized the existence of an independent Palestinian state last week. The Czech Republic and Hungary, on the other hand, both called Karim Khan's warrant unacceptable. Should warrants actually be issued, those divides are only likely to grow. According to the New Statesman, such warrants could both split the EU and help divide Europe from America. However, the knock-on effect to the wider world should not be overstated. Realistically, the biggest impact of this week's news is likely to be a shrinking of Israel's horizons. Foreign policy makes the point that Hamas is not much connected to the wider world beyond its ties with neighboring states like Iran and Lebanon. Israel, by contrast, is a soft power leader. Its business people, academics, and artists all working and collaborating across the world. Should a warrant be issued against Netanyahu and Israel refuse to comply with it, then the Jewish state could slowly be relegated to pariah status, shunned by its academic and business peers, even in parts of America. What foreign policy calls a quieter but much more effective boycott. That's hardly the sort of impact that could affect the current war in Gaza, but it could negatively affect Israel's long-term future. At the time of writing, it remains unknown whether the ICC will sign off on Karim Khan's request for arrest warrants, but what is clear is that this week could become a defining moment in geopolitics, a moment that could impact the future not just of one country fighting a conflict in the Middle East, but also those of its allies and foes alike. And moving on from the ICC, we turn our attention to Slovakia in the aftermath of a shock assassination attempt against Prime Minister Robert Fico. There, Slovak authorities have begun to question whether their initial understanding of the attacker's motives, that he was self-radicalized and acted alone, may have been incomplete, and whether a larger network may have been involved in the plot to kill the PM. Even for those who may not be entirely up to speed on their Slovak politics, the attack on Prime Minister Fico broke through into global headlines, but we'll review the details of the assassination attempt anyhow. The attack went down on May the 15th as Fico was surrounded by a crowd of political supporters following a daytime meeting amongst government officials in the town of Handlova. A 71-year-old poet named Juraj Centula yelled for the PM to approach him and then drew a gun and shot Fico 5 times. Most shots traveled to the stomach, although one hit Fico's arm. Although Fico's security detail was caught off guard by the shooting, officers were able to get Fico into a car and spirit him away to a rendezvous with an air ambulance, and he was able to be triaged with life-threatening injuries. The shooter, Centula, was immediately detained. At the time of writing, Fico has been treated with multiple surgeries and is expected to survive and make at least a partial recovery. Whether he'll return to his role as Prime Minister, that's less clear. But as Fico fought for his life in hospital, more details began to emerge around the suspect's identity and possible motive. As we mentioned, Juraj Centula is a 71-year-old poet, far from the conventional profile of a person who might try to carry out a targeted political assassination, and nor is Slovakia a place characterized by political violence. Centula had experience working as a security guard in a shopping mall, and his son has since attested that he legally held a firearms license as a result of that work, but otherwise, Centula simply doesn't bear resemblance to other politically motivated shooters of our time. Instead, he's known mostly for a few collections of poetry and 2 novels. He's known to have been associated with a far-right, pro-Russia paramilitary group back in 2016, and even had written out his self-professed understanding of mass murderers in the event of failures in government. But his views seem to have changed since then. Even around that time, Centula had also founded an organization against the use of violence to express discontent. By the early 2020s, Centula's political beliefs appear to have shifted leftward, at least somewhat, but while that shift would have put him at odds with Fico's policies, and by all accounts it did, Centula apparently gave off no outward indicator that he would resort to violence himself. If anything, it's become clear that a younger version of Centula might have quite liked Slovakia's current Prime Minister. Fico has served as Prime Minister before, but returned to his post in October 2023, and since he came back, his political party has been making moves widely condemned as a power grab by his political opponents. Always a populist and a skeptic when it comes to the European Union, Fico had returned to office on the back of an anti-immigrant, anti-NATO, anti-US and anti-LGBT campaign. Per the Telegraph, the shooter Centula expressed similar and strong anti-immigrant beliefs in the past, using some language that we'll leave it to you to read. But More relevant, in advance of the attack against Fico himself, was the Fico's government decision to open dialogue with Russia, rein in Slovakia's punishments for acts of corruption, dismantle a special prosecutor's office, and attempt to impose a set of reforms on a public broadcasting group as part of a broader feud with Slovak mainstream media. That appears to have made a far greater difference for Cintula, especially Fico's attempts to control the media and, as he saw it, cover up corruption by Fico's own allies. Cintula is on video, albeit unverified video, making recent statements to express his disagreement with Fico's policies and specifically his lack of anti-gambling regulation. As per new revelations in the days following Cintula's detention, he may have been especially incensed by Fico's outreach to Russia and the election of a Fico ally to the Slovakian presidency. Yet even still, there is a massive gulf between the generally anti-Fico beliefs that Cintula's friends and family can attest to and the man who shot 5 rounds into Fico's torso and arm on May 15th. In the days immediately following the assassination, Slovak investigators' best guess, or at least as it was framed to global media, was that Cintula was a so-called lone wolf, an assassin operating basically by himself to carry out a premeditated attack. As for why he might have felt so compelled to shoot the PM, the leading theory was that he had been radicalized fairly rapidly amongst the political turmoil and upheavals of the last few months. That explanation, incomplete as it was basically the best guess investigators had on a possible motive until the 19th of May, when Slovakia's interior minister attested that the lone wolf theory may not have been accurate at all. Said the Interior Minister, a man named Masos Estok, investigators were now looking to see whether Cintula had fallen in with an organization of people online who had been encouraging each other to carry out an assassination. Per Estok, Cintula's internet communications history was deleted 2 hours after the attack on Fico, but not by Cintula himself, and almost certainly not by his wife. According to Estok, that was evidence that another party may have been involved, and that party, whoever they may have been, wiped Cintula's message history in order to avoid being found out. 2 days after the Interior Minister's announcement, the company Meta attested that it had removed the shooter's Facebook account on the night of the incident, but that it had informed Slovak authorities about that action. Per Slovak authorities, the theory that Cintula had worked with or been influenced by outside accomplices remains the most likely one. At the time of writing, Cintula has been charged with attempted murder, and Robert Fico has not yet been released from hospital. Across Slovakia, the nation has reacted with near unanimous agreement that the divisive political environment in the country has made such explosions of violence more likely, not less. But it's there that agreement among the divided nation seems to stop. Although Slovak majority and opposition politicians have roundly condemned the nation's political infighting, all sides blame each other for the root of the issue, and when it comes to what should be done in order to prevent future acts of political violence, there's little consensus at all. Slovak President-elect Peter Pellegrini has called on a stop to campaigning in Slovakia ahead of a set of European Parliament elections, while Fico's deputy has laid the blame for the shooting directly at the feet of the Slovak opposition as a result of the opposition's, quote, false narratives. Said the deputy PM, quoting here, "Our Prime Minister several times mentioned in the past that he was afraid that this would happen." The Interior Minister, another Fico ally in condemnation of the Slovak media, said, quoting again, "Many of you were those who were sowing this hatred." The opposition and the media have turned the blame back on the Fico government, and one prominent foreign affairs correspondent even alleged that Slovak newsrooms were being patrolled by police. Once Fico becomes able to contemplate a return to public life, many of Slovakia's lingering points of tension will be resolved one way or another. But whether Fico returns to the premiership or someone else takes over, the ideas that endeared Fico to the Slovak people and embittered him to Juraj Cintula will likely continue to guide the nation. As a NATO and European member, Slovakia's drift away from its current alliances and toward Russia has major implications for the entire continent. For an organization in NATO that already struggles enough in its attempts to secure unanimity with its rogue members Turkey and Hungary, a Slovakia opposed to cooperation could turn into a major problem. Should Fico's popular political movement become even more popular, riding on sympathy and public outrage on the back of this assassination attempt, then the actions of one Juraj Cintula may see Slovakia even more firmly entrenched in the policies Cintula was so seemingly compelled to try and stop. Next up, we travel to the Pacific archipelago of New Caledonia, a French overseas protectorate that has been rocked by startling levels of unrest over the last 2 weeks. Brought on by a controversial vote reform package, protests have rapidly turned to violence, arson, and looting in a conflagration that has rocked the islands to their very core. In a broad sense, the idea that no news is good news leaves something to be desired, at least where geopolitics are concerned. But the small island protectorate of New Caledonia, total population barely 270,000, sitting just south of Vanuatu, is one of those places where no news is good news really does apply. By and large, it only ever makes the news in the 21st century because of occasional referendums on independence from France and for the occasional story of the impact of climate change on Pacific Island nations and territories. So when deadly riots broke out on the 13th of May, global analysts were forced to dust off their old volumes on the overseas French colonies, and global news consumers were largely preoccupied with the task of learning that New Caledonia exists. But as the situation has progressed, it's become very clear very quickly that the situation in New Caledonia is gravely serious, and that the repercussions of the unrest could very quickly begin to go global. Now, in order to understand any of what's happening in New Caledonia today, we've got to ask that you bear with us for a brief history lesson. New Caledonia's population is primarily split between two groups: the indigenous Kanak people, who comprise nearly half of the islanders, and the French-descended Caledoche, who make up about a third of the population. In the 1980s, a Kanak independence movement led to widespread violence and gun battles across the island, culminating in a hostage crisis in 1988. The series of accords that eventually brought an end to the violence ultimately guaranteed the Kanak 3 referendums on independence, but only people who lived on New Caledonia at the time and their children were eligible to vote, and even they could only vote if they lived on the islands uninterrupted for 10 years prior to each referendum. That led to mass numbers of prospective voters being unable to participate in the political process, and when all 3 referendums failed to secure a majority for independence, the archipelago's political system basically broke down for a while. The 3rd referendum was the subject of intense boycotts and public backlash, and pro-independence activists basically argue that political reforms cannot even be attempted until the fundamental problem of that referendum is addressed. But the deadlock became a much more serious issue in early 2024 when France began to revise the New Caledonian constitution to, quote, unfreeze the electorate. By and large, that meant that a lot more people would be able to vote, which was a good thing. The New Caledonian National Assembly agreed. But after consulting leaders across the archipelago community, they also got one overwhelming message about the reforms: don't implement them right now. With political tension already at an all-time high, waves of educated Kanak leaving the islands and becoming ineligible to vote under the new laws, and widespread fear among the Kanak that France either might try to bring massive numbers of white French settlers to replace them, or was already doing so, it was not a good moment to introduce more political upheaval. Add to that the simple fact that the rule was written in a way that would introduce significantly more non-Kanak voters to the overall pool. It did seem like the reforms started to look like a mortal threat to the idea of Kanak independence. Said one Caledonian pro-independence group, quoting, "If you make a change of the electorate, it will be war. Our youth is ready to go for it. If we have to sacrifice 1,000, we will do so." Yet above the flashing red lights and the blaring sirens indicating that now was really not the time, France's Senate voted to endorse the amendments in early April. Weeks later, pro-independence New Caledonians took to the streets, countered by pro-French marches, with the combined totals of claimed attendees by the two groups totaling nearly 100,000, or nearly a third of the entire population. The French National Assembly was scheduled to vote on the amendments on May the 15th, and 2 days before they did, all hell broke loose. The first day of mass unrest came with levels of violence that New Caledonia hadn't seen since the 1980s. Protests turned to looting, with numerous businesses set alight by arsonists and robbed in smash-and-grab mass attacks. Among the targets were large car dealerships and factories, as well as local supermarkets. Unspecified, but, quote, numerous police officers sustained injuries, while 36 New Caledonians were arrested. The local government responded by setting a strict curfew, banning the sale or carrying of weapons, and banning the sale of alcohol. The schools were shuttered and flights were grounded. New Caledonian independence movements insisted that they had not called for the violence, yet it continued. A day after the riots began, France dispatched extra police squadrons as the sun rose on an island now dotted with informal roadblocks and torched vehicles. Prison riots kicked off. France declared a state of emergency, and TikTok was banned after authorities claimed it was helping rioters to organize their actions. On May 15th, New Caledonia announced the first deaths. 3 young Kanak, along with a 4th fatality announced in France in the form of a 24-year-old police officer who had been shot in the head while speaking with residents. On the 15th of May, New Caledonia announced the first deaths. 3 young Kanak, along with a 4th fatality announced by France in the form of a 24-year-old police officer who had been shot in the head while speaking with residents. In the following days, 2 more people would die, for a total death toll at the time of writing of 6. By May the 18th, police had ceded control of several neighborhoods despite their reinforced numbers, while locals had begun to organize into ad hoc militias, and more of the island's chain settlements and buildings are being reduced to smoking rubble. At present, up to 90% of New Caledonia's grocery infrastructure has been destroyed, and over 150 businesses are confirmed to have been demolished as well. As New Caledonia's turmoil extends to a second week, Australia and New Zealand have begun to organise the evacuation of their citizens in a grim indicator that they do not believe that order can be restored anytime soon. France, too, has begun to pull its citizens out, and French forces remain hard at work, clearing dozens upon dozens of roadblocks on the freeway leading to the international airport. Access to food and medicine across the island is now starkly limited, especially in parts where roadblocks made by pro-independence rioters have become far more strict and far harder to circumvent. In an attempt to deal with the violence directly, French President Emmanuel Macron has resolved to visit the territory, a visit that at the time of writing still has to take place. Per the French government, Macron's time in New Caledonia will be focused on reconstruction and political mediation, ideally with a wide range of political factions and forces on the territory. But just how interested the New Caledonian independence movement is in reconciliation is still unclear, and it's very much in doubt that those leaders could put a stop to the rioting even if they wanted to. Remember, it's the actions of the French legislature, not the New Caledonia local government, that forced New Caledonia to a boiling point even after local leaders roundly agreed that now was not the time to effect broad change. Said one Kanak socialist activist of Macron's visit, quote, "Here comes the fireman after he set the fire." Whether Macron is willing to suspend the electoral reform remains to be seen, and if that doesn't happen, then it's very difficult to envision a sequence of events that could end the violence on the archipelago. Whatever Macron manages to accomplish on his trip, he faces intense pressure from both France and New Caledonia to find a settlement, but at the same time, pressure on Macron is rising globally, not necessarily to address the injustice or the embarrassment of the New Caledonian riots, but to mitigate their very real and growing impact on the global economy. The issue here is nickel, a very important element used in the fabrication of steel, electric vehicle batteries, and a wide range of other important items. And New Caledonia produces a whole lot of the stuff. In fact, it's believed to hold up to 30% of the world's nickel reserves, and nickel comprises a full 90% of New Caledonia's export revenues. In a broad view, the importance of that nickel is believed to correspond directly to France's belief in the importance of keeping New Caledonia. But now, the price of nickel is skyrocketing at a time when the battle for global mineral and raw material deposits is raging like never before. Sanctions on Russian nickel had already put significant stress on the global market. Mine closures and reduced investment have made the problem worse, and with the US and Europe looking to build supply chains to get their nickel without being threatened by China, New Caledonia is nothing short of indispensable. In fact, it's nickel that's at the core of everything going on in New Caledonia, both before the current protests turn to riots and likely in the future. New Caledonia's unrest is due in large part to New Caledonia's difficulties in competing with the world's preeminent nickel producer Indonesia and the economic strain that came from a near 50% plummet in global nickel prices in 2023. Introduction of constitutional reforms on the archipelago would have been bad at any stage, but they were especially unwelcome at that moment. And with New Caledonia acutely aware of just how badly the rest of the world needs that nickel, it stands to reason that mining and redistribution of the stuff will be the unspoken critical element looming over future mediation. The world, including the collective global West, has done a whole lot worse than recognizing a violent independence movement in order to secure resources that were in far greater supply globally than nickel. Play their hand right, and these New Caledonian independence groups have a real shot at making the case that they, not the French, are the right people to hold stewardship of their home's most precious resource. Play their cards wrong, make themselves appear as if they might be long-term threats to the global nickel market, and they may quickly find themselves facing down far more formidable enemies than a couple of thousand French police and the cutting oratory of Emmanuel Macron. But it's worth really emphasizing here that especially with prices already so volatile, a sovereign New Caledonia could become a relatively wealthy nation, a nickel-driven version of a rich petrostate. That's a far cry from the state of affairs today, when young Kanak are motivated to take to the streets in part because of stunning and very obvious wealth disparities on the archipelago and the limited prospects they face in trying to compete with French migrants for work. And finally, there's one wrinkle in the story of North Caledonia, one with a name that we strongly suspect very few of our viewers will see coming: Azerbaijan. Although it sits halfway around the world from New Caledonia, and although it doesn't have much of a habit of getting involved with sovereignty movements against major European nations, the French government is insistent that Azerbaijan is playing a key role in New Caledonia's turmoil. And their evidence is pretty compelling. In recent days, Azeri flags have come out of nowhere and become just as common as New Caledonian liberationist ones, and organizations within Azerbaijan who share ties with the national government are going out of their way to openly back the separatist movement while condemning Paris. Azerbaijan has denied the accusations out of hand, but France, a close ally of Azerbaijan's longtime rival Armenia, has been at odds with the government in Baku for years. A relatively new Azeri organization called the Baku Initiative Group led a conference in 2023, bringing together New Caledonians and representatives of several other French protectorates with the aim of supporting, quote, French liberation and anti-colonialist movements. Per the French government, Turkey too has started to get involved, with Russia and China being seen as parties ultimately responsible for the interference of both Baku and Ankara. And when factoring in Russia and China to the whole mess in New Caledonia, all roads, again, travel back to nickel. In reality, it's not so simple as to just suppose that such a precious deposit of raw materials currently resting within the grasp of Europe and the US would simply remain there uncontested, regardless of how New Caledonia's separatist woes play out. Instead, potential political upheaval in New Caledonia is a route by which Russia, China, and their allies, including Azerbaijan, stand to capitalize. Between China and Russia's indigenous stores of nickel, collectively amounting to some 14% of the global market, and their ability to source the stuff from Indonesia and the Philippines, the value to controlling New Caledonia's resources isn't a matter of filling their own emergent need. But with New Caledonia's reserves brought under their control, Russia, China, and their partner nations would gain all but unilateral control of the global nickel market. Do that, and they gain the ability to exert valuable leverage against the global West, and potentially even collaborate to throttle the market as they see fit. Although it's a small territory that few outside the Francophone world have ever heard of, New Caledonia is a critical strategic asset for whichever global partners it favors, making the reprehensible violence happening there and the real pain felt by the people all the more important to resolve in a way that puts a permanent and productive end to the issue of New Caledonian independence. Whether that's sovereignty, whether it's enhanced trade and economic relationships as a territory, whether it's fully autonomous status or something else entirely, we won't know until a settlement ultimately emerges. But whatever the answer is, it's got to come fast, because where nickel is concerned, the rest of the world just can't afford to sit around and wait. And in our final story today, we turn our attention to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Now, here on the Situation Room, we've been following the situation in the DRC for the better part of a year as a massive and growing rebel offensive in its eastern regions, international tensions with Rwanda, and an authoritarian and deeply corrupt state combined with intense foreign hunger for copper, cobalt, and other precious resources that we mentioned a moment ago. But on Sunday, May 19th, news broke out of Kinshasa that the violence and chaos of the country's outer reaches has finally come to the capital city itself. A coup was underway, with some of the world's most critical resources hanging in the balance. The attack began at 4 a.m. local time when gunshots rang out across the DRC's capital city of Kinshasa. In a two-pronged assault, dozens of coup plotters split their attention between a primary attack on the president, Felix Tshisekedi, at the center of the city, and a secondary assault on the home of a man named Vital Kamerhe, who's expected to become Speaker of the National Parliament. Also on the target list were the homes of the DRC's new Prime Minister, Judith Suminwa, and the Defense Minister, Jean-Pierre Bemba. However, the attacks on these locations were unsuccessful. Dressed in camouflage and armed with automatic weapons, the group assaulting Tshisekedi's presidential palace was able to break in, prompting a firefight that left several dead in the aftermath. In a distinctly 21st century touch, the assault was streamed live on Facebook, with the coup plotters declaring to their viewers that they intended to end the Tshisekedi government. Brandishing the nation's pre-1997 flag of Zaire, the group was able to cause chaos against both its targets, but was quickly outmaneuvered by larger police and security forces. Within an hour or two, the entire coup had been neutralized, with Felix Tshisekedi still firmly in control. But while a coup attempt like this is, quite frankly, not a surprise for the DRC, the circumstances behind this particular incident are a bit more unusual. The reasons why start with the coup's leader, a relatively unknown Congolese opposition politician named Christian Malanga. Based in the United States and accompanied in the coup attempt by his US-born son and 2 other Americans, Malanga is believed to have been the frontline leader for a larger opposition movement. Said a former UN political advisor named Dino Matani of the coup leader, quote, He had weird and wonderful connections developed during his time in the diaspora, was known to be a sort of eccentric gunslinging type, all the while developing this narrative around how he was going to bring order and progress to Congo. Malanga is known to have gold mining interests in the Congo, something he worked on with another of the Americans involved in the plot, a 36-year-old cannabis entrepreneur from Maryland. His website claims that he's had meetings with high-ranking Vatican and American officials, and that he refers to himself as president of a government in exile, referred to as New Zaire. A publicly available manifesto tells of Malanga's ambitions to reform Congolese business and security, and pictures on social media depict him alongside formerly high-ranking US congressmen. But he was not a prominent figure in the opposition within Congo, and not by a long shot. In fact, his connections to the rest of the Congolese diaspora aren't anywhere near the sort of stuff that might make him a good figurehead of a global anti-Tshisekedi sentiment, nor a candidate to sweep back into the country and claim the role of leader through either peaceful or violent means. And while the coup attempt was quite clearly intended to succeed, it's worth emphasizing just how unlikely it seems in retrospect that it ever could have succeeded. By all accounts, the Congo's military and police are not the world's best equipped to fight a large-scale battle, but defeating some 50-odd gunmen, even well-armed ones, is a far cry from defeating a full-scale military assault. Not only that, but with the DRC's well-established political elite, it's very difficult to buy the idea that even a successful attack on the presidential palace, or even the capture or killing of Felix Tshisekedi, would have seen the entire rest of the DRC just swear its loyalty to the person who deposed him. Frankly, as fragile as the DRC's political ecosystem is, it's not the sort of place where an outside agitator would be the right person to turn the whole thing on its head. If a coup really did lead to a political shift there, it would come by way of the Congolese military or as a matter of palace intrigue. It certainly wouldn't come from a band of a few dozen apparent outsiders lacking a power base and including in their war party the 21-year-old son of its leader, a young man who appeared to have little or no combat training and who brought a friend whose family attests that they thought their son was going on vacation with the Malanga family. And while a couple of US citizens were involved in the plot, it seems unlikely that this is the sort of action that would have been endorsed by the US or any other power looking to destabilize the DRC. Not only was at least one of the Americans involved an ex-con who had conspired to traffic some 20 kilograms of marijuana across the United States, but more broadly, the plot appears nowhere near complete enough that a major global player would sign off on it. But as the dust settles from the coup attempt, it's difficult to reconcile the apparent disconnect between a leader who seemed convinced enough of his cause that he lost his own life storming Tshisekedi's palace and the dismal reality of his failed coup attempt. One possible explanation comes by way of the expert we referenced earlier, Dino Matani, who has attested that Malanga the Elder had been on his radar for some time. Per Matani, the man was previously engaged in a purported plot to kill a prior Congolese president, one Joseph Kabila, and that Malanga had a long-standing obsession with the idea of claiming power in some form within the Congo. DRC officials have indicated that Malanga's first involvement in an aborted coup attempt may have come a year earlier, in 2017. Matani's running theory is that Malanga may have been set up, perhaps in order to draw him to Kinshasa and deal with the long-standing political threat he presented, or otherwise may have been betrayed or abandoned by allies who may have originally pledged far greater support than the coup attempt ultimately got. Said Matani, quote, "Somebody put him up to this. It could be external plotters, but given his previous close relationship with at least one of Tshisekedi's current military commanders, there's some chance this plot was known about internally and this allowed them to move quickly." Whether that was Malanga's plan to leverage his connections and draw the military into the coup, or whether such a plan might have led him stumbling into Tshisekedi's grasp, is tough to say. But as Matani explains it, quote, "It really is difficult to imagine how 20, 30 guys thought that by storming the presidential palace when nobody is around at 4 a.m. in the morning could somehow take over the Congolese state. Making matters worse, the DRC's leaders don't tend to use the presidential palace much anyhow, specifically because of the security concern around coup attempts just like this. If anything, the failed coup attempt has led to an unusual degree of consensus around the world in terms of just how many nations and organizations have either condemned or dismissed it outright. The United States has vowed to collaborate with the DRC to prosecute American citizens who took part, and the United Nations has issued a particularly strong condemnation of the coup, a telling decision at a time when the UN is in the process of getting itself out of the Congo. The African Union has joined in condemning the action and has praised the Congolese military's handling of the incident. At the time of writing, Tshisekedi has yet to speak on the incident directly. Now, regardless of how bungled or ill-advised it may have been, the coup attempt still comes at a difficult time for the Tshisekedi government. Despite the president having found his way to a re-election that's been broadly decried as illegitimate, he's not yet assembled a government, and divisions within his ruling coalition have led to the postponement of parliamentary votes. In the eastern reaches of the country, the exceptional violence of the M23 rebel group, allegedly funded by Rwanda, has led to devastation, and peacekeepers from both the UN and East Africa have been expelled on grounds of ineffectiveness, while an anticipated peacekeeping attempt by South Africa is expected to eventually lead to a similarly crushing failure. Yet, as researcher Paul Nantulia describes in an interview with Al Jazeera, this coup attempt still hands Tshisekedi leverage to get more power. While Malanga seems to have been a true believer in the overthrow of Tshisekedi, it's entirely feasible that he may have been lured to Kinshasa on false pretense in order to be dispatched quickly and cleanly and create the sort of spectacle that would hand Tshisekedi an excuse to consolidate authority. Said Nantulia, quote, "A coup, no matter how shambolic, disorganized, and silly, is a powerful weapon in the hands of a paranoid regime. It gives you a blank check to switch on all the draconian pieces of legislation and law, to declare martial law, to ban NGO and civil society activity, curtail movement and free speech at your whim, sow fear in opponents, and beat everyone into silence." This would not be the first or the last in Congo. This is the well-worn script of failed coups, if we can call it that. That sentiment was echoed by prominent Congolese opposition leader Martin Fayulu, whose party issued a statement that the people of the DRC are, quote, "right to wonder what the next pretense will be for yet more control and overreach by Tshisekedi himself."